So before actually starting my shiur, I just want to say how proud I am that my talmidim turned to be marbitzei Torah. So the Rosh chabura, Rabbi Yeshua, is one of my beloved and precious talmidim. And I see his father sitting here, and I'm sure that you're very proud of your son, Rabbi Yehuda. I know that Yeshua was supposed to be here, but he had some important things to take care of this morning. And Baruch Hashem, it's a tremendous schus. Learning Torah. Every day in the morning we say Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam. Teaching Torah is even a greater schus than learning Torah. And marbitzei Torah always struggle with the right balance. Should I spend more time on my personal growth, learning Torah? How much time should I dedicate to be teaching to others? And I always quote Rashi in Avodah Zorah Daf Lamed Hey Omed Beis. It's actually a Gemara, but the Gemara is in Aramaic and Rashi is in Lashon Kodesh, so I prefer quoting Rashi. And Rashi says, "Hamalamed Torah la'acherem, soides ha'Torah mizgaren loi lelo Torach." You never lose out by teaching others. And when you teach others, you have siyata d'shmaya. Time-wise, you might have less time to learn for yourself, but you have siyata d'shmaya. And soides ha'Torah mizgaren loi lelo Torach, without an effort. Well, I assume you need somewhat of an effort, but it is a special siyata d'shmaya. So Rabbi Yeshua, I'm so happy to be at the beginning of this new chabura, and I hope that very soon you will need to have more space, and you'll need to move to another shul in Beit Shemesh. So, what?
We'll expand this one.
Oh, expand this one is even a better solution. But temporarily, obviously, they will need to find someone else. And Baruch Hashem, it's a big schus. So, for the past few years, Rabbi Yeshua has been learning in one of the beautiful Kollelim in Yerushalayim, in a tremendous Mukum Torah. And his Rosh Kollel is here as well, and that is Talmidi Ahuvi Yedid Nafshi Hagon Reb Chaim. So it's a big schus, and I'm happy to be here this morning, even though I have a very busy day. So I, in the car, I looked at this beautiful Kinterest, and I think it'll be a tremendous help learning the sugya of Pas Akum. And I will just give a brief introduction to not only the sugya of Pas Akum, but the broader sugya of Benoiseihem. And just opening our Kuntres in the very beginning, Siman Kuf Yud Beis is the tour. Pas Shel Goyim. And that is page 1 in our Kuntres. And Pas Shel Goyim. יש דברים שעושים חכמים אף על פי שאין להם מכם מן התורה, כמו פס של גויים אפילו עופר ישראל. ושלא כשמבש להם הגויים. Pas Akum, that's Siman Kuf Yud Beis. And I understand we're focusing on Siman Kuf Yud Beis. Bishul Akum, that's Siman Kuf Yud Gimel. ואסור לשתות במשימות אפילו שעה משקים שאין בהם חשש יין נסך. And all of these were prohibited by the Chachamim. כל אלו הדבורים אסרו משום חסנוס. פירוש שלא יבואו להסחתן בהם. שכל אלו מושכין לב האדם, ואם יזכרב אליהם באחד מאלו, יבוא להסחתן בהם. So the Gemara uses the expression binoiseihem and also chasnus. Chazal were concerned about intermarriage, which is probably the gravest and an aveira chamura biyoso. And so Chazal built moats and walls around our community just to distance ourselves of becoming too friendly and too close with our neighbors, with the goyim. So obviously throughout the ages, we had no other way. We needed to deal with them, we needed to do business with them, we need to interact with them. So Chazal, with their ultimate wisdom, understood but what would be the boundaries that we shouldn't cross. Don't mingle, don't become too friendly. So don't drink with them, don't eat with them, don't party with the goyim. And that is the fundamental idea in which Chazal answered many different things. And the common denominator, the tzad shova, is food and drinks. You could do business with them, you could buy from them and sell to them, but don't mingle and don't party with the goyim. And these sugyas are centered in Avodah Zarah from Chof Tes till Lamed Hey, Lamed Vav, Lamed Zayin. Those are the sugyas of B'nai Seyem. Stam Yainam, not Yayin Nesach. Stam Yainam, Sheicha, Pas Akum, Bishul Akum. All of these are Mishum B'nai Seyem. Bishul Akum, two different opinions in the Rishonim. Some say it is Mechashash Macholas Asurais. Rashi says it is also Mishum B'nai Seyem. And the fundamental question which I want to speak about briefly this morning is, how do we relate to these Isurim? Are they like any other Macholas Asurais? And just like there are Macholas Asurais that are Osam in Torah, and other Macholas Asurais that are Osam Midarabanan. Bosa oif b'cholav is only in Issa Derabanan. Bosa behema b'cholav is in Issa Dioraisa. In the lav of Gid HaNosha, there are Isurim Derabanan, beyond Isurim Dioraisa. Trumas HaMais is Bizman Hazeh. And Machlokes in the Gemara and Bavli Yana Yerushalmu, it's Osam in Torah, Osam in Derabanan. So how do we relate to Pas Akum, Bishul Akum? Do they go back and fall into the general category of Isur Macholas Asurais Derabanan, or would it be more of a Gavra type of Isur and not a Chefza type of Isur? Because after all, the food is the same food. Their bread and our bread, same ingredients. Their dish and our dish, same ingredients. Their wine and our wine are just exactly the same wine. So do we say the ownership over the fact who cooked this food, does that render the food as Macholas Asuras Midarabonan? But all the other Macholas Asuras Derabonan are types of food. But in our case, we're dealing with exactly the same food, the same ingredients, the same drinks, and the same bread. So would we still say it's like any other Macholas Asuras Derabonan, or would we say no? This is not Macholas Asuros. This is Chasnes. This is B'nai Seyem. This is Ahar Chok. And the nafkaminas between these two different interpretations would be manifold. Is there an Issa Blia? Obviously, by Blia, there is no Chashash B'nai Seyem. We're not using their bread. It's a kli in which a guy cooked food. And he cooked food 3 weeks ago, and I'm just using the same vessel, the same kli. So the Chashash B'nai Seyem wouldn't be that relevant, but if we say it's Macholas Asuras, then it's Macholas Asuras. All Macholas Asuras, Aser Kalim, whether it's Issa Torah or Issa Derabanan. That would be one nafkamina. The other nafkamina, we have a basic rule regarding Tekonos Chachamim. And in Tekonos Chachamim, the general rule is Masha Osro, Osro, Masha Loi Osro, Loi Osro. The Masha Osro, the Gezeres are intact, even though the reasoning is no longer that reasonable. And the basic source to this fundamental halachic principle is in Beit Daf Hey, Yom Tov Sheni Shel Goliyos. Thousands of years ago, Chazal said Yom Tov Sheni Shel Goliyos, and the reasoning was we wouldn't know. People didn't know whether it's a Chodesh Molar or a Chodesh Chosar, so they wouldn't know when is Yom Tov, and therefore Chazal were metaken. You need to keep Yom Tov Sheni because we weren't aware of Kiddush HaChodesh. That is no longer relevant today. It was no longer relevant in the days of the Amoraim because they stopped being Mekadosh al Pioriyah, and Hillel, not Hillel HaZokan, but his great-great-grandchild, was matakan the luach, the Jewish calendar, and nevertheless Chazal say, Hizaru b'minhag avoseichem shebiyodechem, and that turned into a fundamental principle in halacha. Masha chachamim asro, the Isser is intact even though the reasoning is no longer that reasonable. So in Shalosh Teshuvos Minchas Osha, there's a fundamental rule which I think is very important. And many times in halacha we do find if the reasoning is no longer reasonable and the rationale is no longer that relevant, that changes halacha. L'moshel gilui. Chazal asad gilui. A cup of water that wasn't supervised for 5 minutes and you didn't overlook the cup of water, you cannot drink. And that is, we are afraid that a venomous serpent, a venomous snake, drank from the cup and there might be poison in the cup. And Tosfos says, and kach nifsak b'Shulchan Aruch, that today there is no issur of gilui because snakes aren't very common in our homes. So the Litvish world is very makpid and gilui, and that is because of the Gro, the Maser Rabba, the Shulchan Aruch paskins that there is no issur of gilui today. So why don't we say if Chachamim Masered, then the issur is forever, even though the reasoning is no longer reasonable? Another example would be Mayim Achronim. Shulchan Aruch brings 2 different opinions on Mayim Achronim. Do we still need to be makpid in Mayim Achronim? It's because of Melech Zdoimus. Salt that comes from the city of Zdam might cause blindness and might affect your vision. So once again, it is Tosfos that says, but we no longer use Melech Zdoimus. So Mayim Achronim wouldn't be a requirement. So when do we say, when Chachamim were metakan atakona, it is forever, and it no longer depends whether the reasoning is still relevant. And I differentiated between tkonos and gezeres, which are forever and they don't change, and chashoshois. A chashash is not a takona. Gilui is not a takona. Gilui is a chashash. Chazal say, you cannot drink this water because you might die. It might cause you physical harm. That is a chashash and not a takona. And if it's a chashash, if it's no longer reasonable, then there is no chashash. The same regarding Mayim Achronim. Chazal care for your health, and they don't chas v'sholem want your eyesight to be diminished, and that's why they say keep away, and you need to have Mayim Achronim when you finish a meal, because we don't want melech zdomis to get into your eyes. That is a chashash. If it's no longer reasonable, then there is no chashash. Masha enken yom tev she'en shegolios, which is a takana. So how do we relate, coming back to our sugya, to chashash ben Isaiah? What are the svaros lakan or lakan? As I explained before, l'choyre chazal asad. Then it's just like any other issur d'Rabbanan. But the counter argument would be, all the other machoros asuros d'Rabbanan are about the heftzah. This is tevel. There is tevel min haTorah, tevel d'Rabbanan. It is bosa b'chalav. So bosa oif is not min haTorah. But in our case, it is exactly the same food. This bread and that bread have exactly the same ingredients. And the same with stam yainam, and the same with bishul nachem. So would we still say it's an issur d'Rabbanan, and being an issur d'Rabbanan, it no longer depends, is there a chashash chasnas or not? Or would we say no? This is more similar to an issur gavra. It's not the heftzah that is osur, and therefore, sometimes we would be mekel if there is no chashash chasnas. It's not reasonable. Sometimes we would be machmir, and we would broaden the scope of this issur because of chashash chasnas. So, I'm assuming Kif Yud Gimel Sif Tet Zayin. Do we have Kif Yud Gimel in here? Probably not. So, could I have a Shulchan Aruch? So let's start off with Kuf Yud Beis, and I think it's page 11 in our Kuntres. Yes, page 11, the very first Sif in Siman Kuf Yud Beis. Does everybody have this Kuntres or Shulchan Aruch? Asro chachomim lechol pas shel amemin oiv di avodah zora mishum chasnus va'afilu b'mokum deleka mishum chasnus asu. So the Ramo clearly says, even when chasnas is totally unreasonable, it is still also. What does he mean, the leke mishum chasnas? What does he mean? The source of this halacha is Tshuvas HaRashba. Tshuvas HaRashba in Chelek Aleph, Simen Reish Mem Ches. Let's have a look at the Taz. Afilu b'mukim de leke mishum chasnas kegon she'ein lo bonim. The baker is not married. He has no kids. Or you might as well have boys and not girls. Nevertheless, there still would be an Isser. And why? Loi plug rabbanon. And loi plug is the fundamental principle I just discussed a few minutes ago. Chachomim asered, the Isser gets a life of itself, and it's no longer dependent on the reasoning. Whether the reasoning is relevant or not, the Isser is still intact. The Shach has a somewhat different approach, and that is Sifchot and Daled in the Shach. And that is what the Rashba is dealing with. The baker happens to be a priest, and they don't marry. So he doesn't have kids. You're not so sure that he doesn't have kids, even if he's not allowed to marry. But the Shach says that is a question that the Rashba is dealing with. And the Rashba offers both explanations, both the Taz and the Shach. And the Rashba on one hand says, Chachomim hishvu midoiseyim, and Chachomim differentiate between one situation and another. And once they answered, the Isser is across the board. And then the Rashba also says what the Shach argues. Mishum chasnas doesn't mean that you're going to marry this baker's daughter. But if you eat their bread, you're going to party with them. You're going to spend time with them. If you eat with them, you might drink with them. And if you drink with them, you might get drunk with them. And down the line, there is somebody waiting out there for you. And that is the Isser of Bnei Seyim. So according to the Taz, our approach to this halacha is, there is no chashash chasnas, but still loy plug. The Isser that Rabbanan stands into itself. And the reasoning is no longer binding. According to the Shach, no, the reasoning of Bnei Seyim is very much relevant. We're not afraid that after saying a moitzi and having one bite, you're going to marry his daughter. But one bite brings another, and then it's a slippery slope, and at the end of the line, there's a chashash of chasnas. So there are two different approaches to these halacha, and both are on the Rashba. But the Rashba does clearly say that the Isser of Bnei Seyim is an Isser d'Rabbanon and loy plug. Kuf Tetzai, Kuf Yud Gimel is Bishul Akum. I assume after Pasakum, which will probably take you a week or two, then you're going to learn Bishul Akum. So Kuf Yud Gimel, Tetzai, we find two different opinions. Does Bishul Akum asa kelim? And that is the other side of the same coin. If we say it's an Isser Rabbanan, it asas kelim. If it's all about chasnus, then it wouldn't be reasonable to asa bliya shebekelim. So I'm reading Sif Tezayin Kuf Yud Gimel. Kelim shebishul lemovid gechov melefanein dvorim sheyesh b'hem mishum bishul lemovid gechovim tzichem hechsher. You need hechsher kelim, and the kelim would asa. The bliya would answer. V'yesh oimrim she'ein tzrichim. And that's the machlokes, the Rashba and the Ra'ah in Bedek HaBayis. The Ra'ah in Bedek HaBayis, Bayis Gimel, the Ra'ah disagrees with the Rashba. And the Ra'ah says, we see from the basics of Gzeres Bnei Seyim that Chazal do differentiate between a situation in which there is a chashash chasnas and a situation in which there is no chashash chasnas. Bayis Gimel, Shar Zayin. And the Ra'ah says, By Pasakum, we differentiate between Pashal Balabayas and Pashal Palter. And the Tur, coming back to our Kuntis, the Tur explains why would there be a difference between Pashal Balabayas and getting bread from a bakery? And that is page number 5. קצת מהמחברים חילקו בין של בעל הבייס לשל פלטר, דלוי שייך חסנוס אלו בשל בעל הבייס. Chasnus is only private home. If you go into a bakery and there are 100 other customers there and you buy a loaf of bread, that doesn't bring you closer to the goyim. But if you go into a neighbor's house and you're going to have from his bread, that is when Chasnus becomes a real concern. So the Ra'o says, Chazal did differentiate between Palter and Balabayas. And regarding Bishul Akum, they differentiated between Oil al Shulchan Malochem ve'enai Oil al Shulchan Malochem. Because if it's not an important dish, then there is no Cheshash Chasnus. So the Ra'o argues, yes, Chasnus is different than any other Isser Rabbanan, and therefore there will be no Isser of B'liyah. So whenever the Mechaber brings two opinions, the first opinion Bistoma and the second opinion Yesh Oimrim, that is a klal in Shulchan Aruch. Many times the Mechaber brings two different opinions, and it all depends on the wording. If it is Yesh Oimrim v'Yesh Oimrim, halacha k'shita basroi, the second opinion. If it is Stam v'Yesh Oimrim, the halacha is k'shita reshoino. In the Sif I just quoted, the Mechaber writes, Kelim, שבשלו בהם גויים, צריכים הכשר. ויש אומרים שאין צריכים הכשר. So the Ikar opinion is צריכים הכשר. And that would be the Rashba. So לגבי Kelim, it would be a chumrah. Lagabe Chasnus, sometimes it'll be a kula. In situations or in different times, changing times, and there is no chashash Chasnus. And the Ikar opinion of the Shulchan Aruch is in accordance to the Rashba, just like any other Isser Rabbanon. V'yesh b'zeh lahokel ulahachmir. The Yad Malachi writes a very important principle. Yes, so we have a basic rule. What is the opinion of the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramo when they bring two different opinions? So the first opinion is Stoma, and the other one is Yesh Oimrim, halacha k'shita reshoina. If it's Yesh Oimrim v'Yesh Oimrim, halacha k'shita basroi. And then the Yad Malachi, who is the source of all these klolim, and he says, so if we have a rule, when the halacha is as the first opinion, and when the halacha is in accordance to the second opinion, why does he bring two opinions? When you learn Beis Yosef, you become aware that almost every seif in Shulchan Aruch is a machlokes. But in the vast majority of seifim, the Mechaber just gives a clear psak. He doesn't bring all the different opinions in Shulchan Aruch. And if there is a basic rule, when the halacha is k'shita reshoina and when k'shita achroina, why does he at all bring two different opinions? So the Yad Malachi says, if the halacha is clear-cut and definitive in accordance to one opinion, the Mechaber wouldn't bring a dissent. He wouldn't bring an opinion that disagrees. If he brings both opinions, it means there is some credence and weight to the other opinion as well. And the nafkamina would be, if the shita achroino she'ein halacha k'moisam is a chumrah, hamachmi tova yolav brocha. Even though b'shas adchak you could be soymech l'kula. If the shita she'ein halacha k'moisam is a kula, then b'shas adchak you could be makel. You have whom to rely on. Even though the ikar halacha is l'chumrah. Even by the Oraisa. But once again, whenever I share with Talmidim Klolei HaPsak, I say the most fundamental rule in Klolei HaPsak is that there are no definitive Klolei HaPsak. We always need to see what the other Achronim say, what the Noise Kalim say. But this rule is lav dafka b'derabonans. It is even b'diuraisis. So, Ikar halacha k'shittas Rashba. However, he also brings the second opinion. that are mekel b'keilem. And the basis of the second opinion is benoiseyim is different than all the other macholos asuros. It is about benoiseyim. And I just want to mention a very relevant sugya that I discussed in my chuvas and in also Minchas Osher and Chumash Devorim. Microwave ovens, is there a chashash of bishul nochlim? And this is such an important question because in thousands of frum homes, there are none frum people taking care of the elderly, of the handicapped, and this is very, very common. You know, we have far more elderly people than we had in the past because of the advance of medicine and technology. And it is extremely common in the frum community for elderly women or elderly men to have, caregivers and non-Jews. And they cook for themselves. So usually they should have an extra little kitchenette for themselves, an extra kalim, but not always is it shaykh. And sometimes there's nobody to cook for these elderly people or to warm up their food. So without going into the various details of Bishul Akum, because right now we're talking about Pas Akum, but would there be an Isser Bishul Akum when we cook in a microwave oven? So in Siman Kuf Yud Gimel Siv Vav, the Mechaber speaks about Ishun, about smoked goods, and the Ramo writes, there is no Isser Bishul Akum, only Bishul Shel Eish, only when you use fire, nothing else. Microwave ovens, there is no fire. There even is no heat source. It is electromagnetic waves that heat water, and only water molecules. So you probably are aware when you use a microwave oven, the food might be hot, but the dish is not hot. The dish is just warmed by the food inside, because microwave ovens cause no molecular change, only an organic material that has water molecules. And if there are no water molecules, there would be no heat. So it is definitely not considered bishul shel eish. Not only it is not bishul shel eish, in a microwave heating system, there is no heat source. The heat is generated in the food. The heat doesn't come from outside. Would there be an Isser Bishul Akum? So both Rav Elyoshiv and Tshuvas Shevet HaLevi, there are two different Tshuvas, Chelek Ches and Chelek Tes, and they argue there is an Isser Bishul Akum, because if this is so common, then there's a Chashash Chasnus. And I say, but if the Ikar Haloch is in according to the Rashba, that there's an Isser of Bliya B'Kelim, then we relate to Bishul Akum just like any other Macholas Asuros D'Rabbanan. It has a chumrah, it also has a kula. And if Chazal didn't answer only Bishul Shel Eish, we cannot broaden the scope of this Isser. We cannot be Mekel, and we cannot be Machmir. So in my opinion, Yesh Mokum Lahokal, cooking in a microwave oven. It is common, but it is still not really common. And most people use microwave ovens to warm up food, not to cook food. And the vast majority of people cooking food would prefer Bishul Shel Eish, like the Ramo writes. But even if it would be common, I think B'Shas Adchak one could be Mekel, because Ikar Haloch and Shulchan Aruch is Kishitas Rashba. And Benoiseyim is like any other Isser D'Rabbanan. Even if the reasoning is no longer reasonable, the Isser still is in place. And on the other hand, Masha lo yasur lo yasur. And if Chazal lo yasur el Bishul Shel Eish, there is no Isser b'Bishul she'eino Shel Eish. So this is just one example. So what we share today is just a general introduction about the broader scope of Benoiseyim, of all of the Isurim sourced in Masechet Avodah Zorah. Kuf Yud Beis is Pas Akum, Kuf Yud Gimel Bishul Akum, Yeinam Shel Goyim is Kuf Chav Gimel, and ultimately, probably you will get deeper into these sugyas, but what I share today is a general overview and introduction about the concept of chasnus, of binoiseyem, and the most fundamental question in these sugyas, which you will come back to again and again and again as you advance in this siman. And we started off the shiur with the very first sif in Kuf Yud Beis. Afilu kishe'ein mishum chasnus deramo, still as an isser of pasakum. And the Shach and the Taz, two different reasons. The Taz saying loy plug, and that is reflecting the Rashba's approach. And the Shach saying it's not only loy plug, there still is a very great risk of benoiseyem, because benoiseyem doesn't mean the daughter of your baker, but the broader chashash that somewhere down the line there is a chashash of chasnus and binoiseyem. So the Shach and the Taz actually reflect two sides of this coin, the two different approaches of the Rashba and the Ra'ah. So you will become familiar with the Rashba and the Ra'ah because they're the Rosh HaMedabrim in these sugyas. So the Rashba was one of the greatest Rishonim. And the Rashba was unique amongst the Rishonim, writing Sforim in three different areas. Chidush HaRashba Rashash, which is commentary, which is Parashonos. Toras HaBayis, which is a halachic sefer, and Chuvas HaRashba. So Toras HaBayis is the house that the Rashba built. And then comes along the Ra'ah, and he writes comments on the Toras HaBayis, sometimes extremely critical, sometimes using harsh language, and he calls it Sefer Bedek HaBayis, which means, I'm going to check this house. And he found the Rashba's house to be very flawed, with some very fundamental problems in structure. But the Rashba is not the one to be pushed around, and the Rashba wrote answers to all the kashas of the Ra'ah, and he called that Sefer Mishmeres HaBayis. And he said, I'm going to take care of my house, and I'm not going to let you find problems in my house. I think my house was well built and well planned and well thought out. So we have the Toras HaBayis, the Bedek HaBayis, and Mishmeres HaBayis. We're not aware that the Ra'ah went on again, so I think Mishmeres HaBayis was the end of the discussion. And these are Sforim you will become very familiar with. So, Rabbi Shua, you should have great siyata d'shmaya in teaching Torah, and I hope you are all part of this chabura. I'm not sure, but I would very much hope so. And if you're not, maybe you would be. So, Baruch Hashem, it's a zchus for me to be here, and I hope to be here more. I cannot say how often, but I will be here again. And we should all be zoicha. So we are at the beginning of a chodesh Mar Cheshvan. Mar Cheshvan is one word and not two. It is not Mar Cheshvan. So when you write a ksuba or chas v'sholem a get, it is one word, Mar Cheshvan. And Hasidic Sforim say that Mar Cheshvan is meloshoin rechusha marachshen sfosov, comes after Tishrei. So Tishrei is the most magnificent month in the Jewish calendar. It is the month of Yom Tovim, starting off with days of awe and yira, and culminating with Simchas Torah, which is the greatest day of Simcha. So the Hasidic Sforim say, Rechusha Malachshin Sfoso, we could continue with the spirit of Tishrei and continue with that same Kedusha. Moav Shumish was a Talmud of Rebbe Melech Melezhensk, and he writes, Chodesh Mar Cheshvan is an expression, and we could examine and test whether we were masing Kedushas Elyonis b'Chodesh Tishrei. And how would we know that we were successful in achieving the Kedusha of Chodesh Tishrei? What would you expect from a Talmud of Rebbe Melech Melezhensk to say? If you say 10 Pirkei Tehillim every day with Kavana, or quoting 3 pages of Zohar every day, or toiling in the mikveh every day in the morning 36 times, or he says, if your Chidushay Torah and Cheshvan are of greater quality than all year round, that is the siman you are Maseh Kedushas Elyonis and Chodesh Tishrei, which is somewhat of a surprise coming from a Talmud of Rabbi Melech Melezhensky. So he writes that Chasidim Akadmoinim learned a lot of halacha and Tosfos and Chodesh Mar Cheshvan, and other Chidushay Torah were of the highest quality. That was the siman that they were Maseh Kedushas Elyonis and Chodesh Tishrei. So my bracha to all of you should be machadash a lot of great Chidushay Torah, and then you will know that your avodah in Chodesh Tishrei was successful, was great. Yerotzen Shiach Elkeinu Amoim. We should all be zoicha lahagla Torah ladira. We should share b'seiras toivos, and we should be zoicha b'korov to a geula shalema b'mheru v'yameinu amen.